Hi, hello guys. Before we move on, let's congratulate our CLAT 2023 toppers. So here we are here to congratulate AAR2 Sahil Gupta, AAR37 Pratyush Chaturvedi, and AAR96 Komal Gadwal. And apart from these three, we had 70 plus NLU admits, guys. So 70 plus people from Unacademy reaching out to NLU. So if you want to be one among them, all that you need to do is subscribe to Unacademy CLAT channel and do subscribe to Unacademy platform and attend our plus classes, take mock tests, and you will be on the list. And this is not just happened in 2023 season. So we have done it in 2022 as well. So in 2022, we had 45 plus people attending from Unacademy going to NLUs, and in 2023 we made it double, close to 70 plus people going there. I'm Kalyan Charan VSG, and today we are going to discuss about family tree of numbers. Now, if I say numbers, what comes to your mind? Help me out with the numbers in the chat box. Now, if anybody who asked me for numbers, I'll start writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, right? So these are all numbers. And suddenly somebody asks me, sir, what happens to -2, -3, -1, right? So on and so forth. Are they numbers? Yes, they are all numbers. And somebody also asked me, sir, what happens to 2 by 3, 4 by 5? Are they numbers? Yes, they are all well numbers. So what happens to 0.5, 0.6, so on and so forth? Are they numbers? Yes, of course. So numbers are vast and been classified into multiple varieties, right? So if we can frame them into a single structure, into a single family tree, then things will be easier for us to understand. So that's where we come out with this family tree of numbers. Guys, remember, whenever somebody asks you to count a number, right, you start counting it from 1, right? All the countable numbers, are nothing but natural numbers, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are said to be natural numbers. If I add 0 to this natural number set, then this becomes whole numbers. So what is whole number? 0 added to the natural numbers. So natural numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. Now we have the negative reflections of this natural numbers. The negative reflection of a natural numbers are nothing but negative numbers. So we have a whole number set and negative number set. Together we call this as an integer pair. Now what are integers? Integers are combination of the natural numbers, 0 and negative numbers. Remember, 0 is neither positive nor negative. Now 2 by 3, 4 by 5, we know them to be fractions, and 0.5, 0.6, we know them to be decimals, right? So like that we have multiple kinds of numbers that exist, right? Now who is the Mool Purush of number system, right? Who is the uh, first person in the numbers, right? The very first person in the numbers is called as complex number, the forefather of numbers, right? So if I quickly say what is a complex number, so you might have learned complex numbers in your 11th grade and all of that. So what is complex number? Complex number is a plus ib. Complex number is combination of real and imaginary. So if I say a being its real son and ib being the imaginary part of it. So complex number has two sons. First son name is real and second son's name is imaginary. Now what is imaginary? We'll look into what is imaginary a bit later. Now come to real. What is real? Real is a number which exists. This real had again two sons. One is rational and other is irrational, right? So the classification is real numbers has been split into rational and irrational. Now what is rational, what is irrational, we'll discuss it further. And what is rational number? Rational number is further split into two parts. One are integers and other segment is fractions. Oh guys, here come our integers. We just now discussed what are integers? Integers are a combination of negative, 0 and positive, which is natural numbers. And we have discussed fractions, isn't it? But what is missing from the tree now? What is missing from the tree is decimals. Guys, fractions could also be represented as decimals. Remember, fractions and decimals together, this part is called as non-integer set. Am I clear with this, guys? Now the family tree is made very simple now. Complex numbers, which has been split into real and imaginary. Real numbers, which is split into rational and irrational, and rational is split into integers and non-integers. In non-integers, we have fractions and decimals, and integers is split into positive, negative, and 0. Okay, now let's get a bit deeper and understand what does each one of them deal with. Now, I said complex number is a plus ib and a is real part, ib being the imaginary part. Now, what does this imaginary part mean? Guys, this I represent under root of a negative term, which means under root of -1. The value of I is under root -1. So, remember, under root negatives doesn't exist, but we imagine them to exist. So, all the things which deal with I are just imaginary. Okay, coming back to this particular part, if there exists a number called -25 under root. How to find the value of under root -25? We know under root 25 for sure is 5, but what happens to under root -25? So, we cannot find the value of it. So, what we do is we write it as under root -1 into 25. We can split that as under root -1 into under root 25, wherein under root -1 whose value is I and under root 25 whose value is 5. So, under root -25 value is 5i. That is how the imaginary world works, right? By taking a part of the real world and clubbing it with something which we tend to imagine and finally coming out with an imaginary number. So, here b is a real number with a prefix of I which makes it into an imaginary number. So, what are imaginary numbers, guys? Under root negatives are nothing but imaginary numbers. Clear with this? Now, come to real part. Now, what is a real part? Real numbers are the numbers which actually exist. We don't need to imagine anything. Now, it has two branches, right? We discussed two sons or two daughters, one daughter, one son. You can assume it either way. Now, what is a rational number? Rational number is a number which can be expressed in the form of p by q, where q, the denominator, should not be equal to 0. A number which can be expressed in the form of numerator upon denominator, where denominator should not be equal to 0, is called as a rational number. That is the definition of a rational number. Now, let us come to irrational number. What is irrational now? Irrational is which has a numerator by denominator format. What is irrational? Irrational which can never be expressed in the form of p by q, which means we can never write that in a form of p by q. Example is the value of pi. Now, if people may question me, sir, we know pi is 22 by 7. Guys, pi value is not 22 by 7, it is approximately 22 by 7. We approximated it, but we can never find the actual format of pi value in p by q, right? And similarly, e, epsilon value, and apart from it, under root 2, under root 3, all the surds are said to be irrational. So, a number which can never be expressed in the form of p by q is said to be irrational. Now, we know that rational being a number which can be expressed in the form of p by q where q should not be equal to 0, because if we divide it with 0, the value will become undefined. Now comes the rational is being split into integers and non-integers. What are integers? We discussed integers are positive numbers, negative numbers and 0, but what is the definition of an integer? Definition of an integer is a number which can be expressed in the form of p by q where q should be equal to 1 or a factor of p. A number which can be expressed in the form of p by q where q equal to 1 or a factor of p. If I say 1 or a factor of p, what do you mean by factor of p? For example, 4 upon 2, is this an integer? We need to check. How do we check? We divide 4 with 2, it goes 2 times and remainder is 0. So, I can write this as 2 upon 1 because 4 goes 2 times, right. So, in the simplest form, when you write a p by q format, in its simplest form, if the denominator is equal to 1, then it is said to be an integer. So, here when 4 divided by 2, we get 2 by 1 because 2 divides 4 with 0 being the remainder. Now, 2 by 3, is this an integer? Obviously no, not, because 2 by 3 itself is the simplest form and 3 is not equal to 1 or not a factor of 2. So, what is a factor? A number which perfectly divides is said to be a factor. So, for example, 2 perfectly divides 4, 6 will perfectly divide 12 or 24 for that matter. So, what is a factor? A number which perfectly divides another number is called as a factor. So, what is the definition of an integer? A number which can be expressed in the form of p by q where q equal to 1 or factor of p is said to be an integer. Now, come to non-integers. What do you mean by non-integers? Non-integers are numbers where in p by q format, q should not be equal to 0 or 1 or a factor of p. For all the numbers which can be expressed in the form of p by q, where q is not equal to 0 or 1 or factor of p, we call them as non-integers. Now, non-integers are divided into fractions and decimals. Now, let us quickly see what are fractions. Fraction is a number, for example, 4 by 3, correct? That is a fraction. Similarly, 2 by 3 is also a fraction, a number which can be represented in the form of p by q where q is not a factor of p or 1 or 0. So, here these are all fractions now. Now, the types of fraction is proper fraction and improper fraction. Now, what do you mean by proper fraction? A proper placement wherein your base has to be larger than the top, correct? Only then we call that as a proper placement, isn't it? Your denominator has to be larger than the numerator, or your numerator in the p by q form, p has to be less than q, we call that as proper fraction, right? Now, what is improper now? Improper is placing a larger entity on the smaller entity, correct? This is an improper placement, right? So, where in p by q form, if p is greater than q, we call that as improper fraction. So, now we know fractions has been split into proper fractions and improper fractions. Now, if it is proper, there is no problem, isn't it? At house everything is proper, you do not need to do anything. If there are improper, we cannot leave things like that, isn't it? So, what we need to do? We need to make improper things into proper. How do we make improper things into proper? So, 4 by 3. So, I can write 4 by 3 as 3 by 3 plus 1 by 3. Oh, if you want me to go one step ahead, I can say that as 4 could be written as 3 plus 1 by 3, wherein I can split it as 3 by 3 plus 1 by 3. We know 3 by 3 is 1 plus 1 by 3. So, I can write it as 1 by 3. So, this is nothing but mixed fraction. So what do you mean by mixed fraction, guys? Mixed fraction is a combination of an integer and a proper fraction. So mixed fraction is a combination of integer and proper fraction. So now we understand fractions has been split into improper fractions and proper fractions, and improper fractions can further be simplified to mixed fractions. Now since we discussed about proper improper fractions, now let's quickly see about decimals, right? So that's the only part in the family which is left out, isn't it? Now if I say decimals, we know that the value of 4 by 3 is 1.3333, so on and so forth. 2 by 3 is 0.66666, so on. 1 by 2 is 0.5. 1 by 4 is 0.25. So these are all decimals which are nothing but another way of representing fractions. Now the decimals is being classified into two parts. One is non-terminating and terminating. So you might be wondering what is terminating. Terminated is truncated, stopped. So decimals which actually stop after a particular number is called terminating decimals. Decimals which are non-terminating is which will never stop. Alright. So if I say classification of decimals, decimals has been classified into two parts. One is terminating and other is non-terminating. If it is terminating, it's easier for us to convert a fraction into a decimal and decimal into a fraction, right, which we'll see it in the next video. Now when it is non-terminating, we split it into two parts. One is recurring and other is non-recurring. What do you mean by recurring? Recurring is repeating. So here if you observe, 6 is repeating, 3 is repeating. And what are non-repeating? For example, 1 by 7, 0.142856, so on and so forth, wherein the terms are not being repeated. Clear? So if it is stopping, no issues. If it is not stopping, which is non-terminating, then it is being split into recurring and non-recurring decimals. Recurring is wherein a term is repeating. Non-recurring is wherein a term is not repeating. So guys, that's about the overall structure or family tree of numbers. So quickly to remind you, complex numbers, which is real and imaginary. Imaginary is something which is under root, a negative term. Real is being split into rational and irrational. Rational is a number which which can be expressed in the form of p by q, where q is not equal to 0. Irrational, which doesn't have a p by q form. And rational is split into integers and non-integers. Integers are where the denominator is 1 or a factor of p, we call them as integers, which is split into positive, negative and 0. And non-integers has been split into fractions and decimals. And fraction is a number which can be written in the form of p by q, where q is not equal to 0 or 1 or a factor of p. And decimals is another way of representing fractions. And fractions has been split into proper fraction and improper fraction. And proper fraction is where the numerator is less than denominator, we call that as proper fraction. And improper is where numerator is greater than denominator, we call that as improper fraction. And improper fractions could also be written in the form of mixed fraction. What is mixed fraction? Mixed fraction is a combination of an integer and a proper fraction. Now decimals are classified into terminating decimals and non-terminating decimals, and terminating decimals are the decimals which stop after a particular point of time, and non-terminating decimals which will not stop, it goes on, right. And non-terminating decimals have been classified into recurring and non-recurring. Recurring decimals are the decimals which has a repetition, and non-recurring is the decimals which has no repetition. Guys, with this family tree we are ending this video, and let's crack it. Keep following our YT channel, and we'll be coming out with the next chapter. In the next chapter we are going to deal with the integers or properties of integers in detail. Thank you very much.